kind people have a wonderful dream. Margaret on the guillotine. 'Cause people like you make me feel so tired. When will you die?
I think it's important today. We're going to go on a bit of a weird one, so do stay with me. I really am going to need your help. I think it might be... well, obviously, your age is going to be quite relevant to the conversation that we're having first this morning, but it's relevant in both directions, if you see what I mean. So we're not actually excluding anybody. The inimitable and rather brilliant producer of this programme, Eleanor, is 28 years old. Yeah, I know. 28 years old. And obviously producing this radio programme, quite plugged into the world of politics. And she said to me, why do they keep talking about Margaret Thatcher? And in my customarily arrogant and dismissive way, I was about to gloss over it and demand that we come up with better ideas for this morning's programme. And I suddenly sort of stopped and thought, yeah, why do they keep talking about Margaret Thatcher? And and I'm 50, right? I was 7 when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, and I was 18 when she left. And oddly, in the same year that she left Downing Street, I sat at politics, an A-level in politics. And I would struggle to tell anybody younger than me why Margaret Thatcher's shadow has loomed so large over this entire Conservative leadership election. Now, you might not like this, but I don't want condemnations and castigations of the so-called Iron Lady in the first part of the programme, because that's not going to help young people. And by young, do I mean anyone under 50? This is what I meant roughly by age. You couldn't answer that question, could you, Keith? No chance. And there's no criticism involved in that. Nigel Lawson has written an article under the headline, Rishi Sunak is the only candidate who understands Thatcherite economics. And Sajid Javid, who, I don't know whether it's because I went on holiday, I thought Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak had sort of acted in tandem to get Boris Johnson out of Downing Street, but he's now, the Saj, has now, good Lord, imagine your life being so empty that was your nickname. Anyway, the Saj has now come out in support of Rishi Sunak, saying, at university I had portraits of my 2 favourite Conservatives on my wall. God, I bet his parties were fun. Who did you have on your wall at university? Probably James Dean and Morrissey, or possibly a cliched Marilyn Monroe photograph, or Linda Luzardi, depending upon your outlooks on life. Sajid Javid had Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Imagine walking into that room in the Hall of Residence in the first week. So let's go and meet the lad. The lad in 43 looks nice. Let's go and say hello, knock hello. We're all heading to oh my God, you've got pictures of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan on your wall. And I think he's about my age, probably a bit younger. Anyway, he goes, there is a time for leaders in the Thatcherite mould, clear-headed, fiscally disciplined. And there are times for Reaganites, freedom-loving, sunny and optimistic. Our country now needs the best of both instincts, said Sajid Javid, coming out in favour of Liz Truss. And of course, Truss and Sunak have themselves both cited or raised the ghost of Thatcher in pursuit of their own popularity. You'll remember the hustings that Nick did last week, and he asked them who their favourite prime ministers were, and they both provided answers that I think merit a little bit of a revisit. Shall we start with Liz Truss? No, we'll start with Rishi Sunak.
If I were to ask you who's been the best ever leader of the Conservative Party and why, who would you pick?
Probably Margaret Thatcher.
Why?
Why? Because she delivered multiple election victories and changed this country for the better.
You were in Grantham, I think, on the weekend, the home of Margaret Thatcher. How would she have responded to the fact that you're the first Chancellor since Labour's Dennis Healey in 1974 to raise corporation tax?
I think she would have responded, as I have done, in gripping inflation first.
He was 1 when she became Prime Minister. So if I at 50 struggle to explain why they're all genuflecting at the altar of Margaret Thatcher in a Conservative leadership election in 2022, then I suspect he'd be struggling too. But there you are. Perhaps it's a curious constituency of people that we need a little bit of help understanding. And I'll say it again, we are not starting with condemnations and castigations. We need to help each other understand what does the word Thatcher mean to these people when, for a huge swathe of the population, almost none of whom are going to have a vote in the looming election, it's a word that is at best a little bit sort of confusing or contradictory, and at worst completely baffling. Time for Elizabeth Truss to nail her colours to Margaret's mast.
Mrs. Thatcher.
And why?
Because she...
I sense again there's some agreement in the room.
She turned our country around. You know, in the 1970s, we were the sick man of Europe. We had low growth. We had massive industrial problems. I mean, I was born in 1975, so I was very young at the time. I didn't see it, but you know, you can watch the newsreels, you can see how appalling it was. And what I sensed in the 1980s is a growing sense of pride in our country and a growing sense of optimism about the future.
And she may be right. Again, she mentions her age, 3 years younger than me. That's quite grim. That's going to be the first Prime Minister ever that's younger. That's a moment, isn't it? Talk about the police getting younger. When it starts happening to the Prime Ministers, you know you've crossed a bit of a Rubicon. But you can find newsreels of protesters getting smacked over the head with batons. You can find newsreels of police officers waving their overtime money in the faces of striking miners. It's a little bit crass to suggest that the newsreels of the era offer up an unalloyed admiration of Margaret Thatcher. But again, I don't want to veer into critique at the moment. I want to veer exclusively into the area of explanation. So pick a person, pick up a person, and explain to them why Margaret Thatcher, why this particular battle to be Prime Minister at times looks like a Margaret Thatcher lookalike contest. It is as if Rishi Sunak and Elizabeth Truss are competing and their supporters are joining in to persuade the Conservative Party membership that they are most like Margaret Thatcher. And I don't want to labour this point, but it has to come from a point of explanation. It may involve negativity and even perhaps a degree of nastiness, but I'd rather it wasn't confined to that. If it is enough in 2022 with this curious electorate, and obviously the demographics of the Conservative Party membership are going to be profoundly relevant to this question. I mean, you know, you might as well say, why does it appeal to largely elderly, largely white, largely male right-wing people, invoking the ghost of Margaret Thatcher? But I still need answers to those questions, and those answers are going to have to include some positives, even if it is only positives for others. Ideally, it would be positives for you. You're listening to this as someone who's a little older than me, and you think you're well placed to explain to me and my 28-year-old producer why the battle for Downing Street has in many ways become a Margaret Thatcher lookalike contest. What is it about her? What is it about her politics? And what is it about her legacy that remains so powerful, apparently, for that constituency of people? Because it doesn't remain powerful for the rest of us, and that's another reason why this leadership contest is so weird. It doesn't have any relevance for the massive majority of the country, but the massive majority of the country is barely represented at all in the electorate that is charged with making this epochal and profoundly important decision. So let's just do it. The number you need is 0345 6060973. You don't have to be the late, great Hugo Young. You don't have to be Margaret Thatcher's biographer in order to answer this question, but you do need to have a slightly better handle on things than I have. And I'd stress again, not tooting my own trumpet by any stretch of the imagination, but I sat an A-level in English and American politics in the year that Margaret Thatcher ceased to be Prime Minister. I got a grade A, and I couldn't really explain to my 28-year-old producer this morning why she remained so prominent and so up front in a leadership debate in 2022 between two people who were respectively, I think for once I'll get this absolutely right, who were respectively 1 year old and 5 years old when she became Prime Minister. Put it like that, and it's a bit weird, right? I understand invoking the ghost of Winston Churchill because of the Second World War and the remarkable shadow that casts over subsequent decades. But for Margaret Thatcher to still have this sort of cachet, I think it's perfectly understandable that people may need a bit of an explanation. Should we break the habit of a lifetime and take a call before the first junction of the morning? I mean, because you're going to have to do the work today, so I think it would be quite fitting to start as we mean to go on. Lee is in Watford. Lee, what's going on? What would you say to a youthful compadre?
Absolutely. Hi, James. I'm your age, exactly, and I have to shamefully admit that I was the chairman of the Young Conservatives from 83 to 87 under Thatcher.
Gosh.
So I was
that's worthy of a Ray Liotta, that, but I don't know if it's appropriate this early in the programme. Carry on.
Exactly, right. So I am the antipathy of everything your listeners and probably you kind of think are the worst of the history. But
nonsense.
Yeah, but yeah, fundamentally Thatcher changed 6 or 7 massive principles for the UK that transformed the economy, transformed people's opportunities, absolutely revolutionised the country. And I was a Thatcherite to the core, right? And I was a Conservative Party donor, member, right up to the day that they did Brexit and appointed Bozza, right? And then I left and I was done, right? So anyway, the Thatcherite...
People forget that she essentially invented the single market, don't they? That's
yeah, big time, right?
But that's not that's not why Sunak and Truss are invoking her ghost, is it? Quite the opposite, in fact.
Not at all, right? Because, she was a massive European advocate for the single market and the benefits of trade and free exports and everything else, right? What's going on is this is a legacy issue for, 50 to 70-year-olds in the Conservative Party, which believe in small government, small state, liberal democracy, rights for all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
What's actually going on is this is just an easy sell to the Conservative Party membership, right?
Okay.
It's nostalgia. It's nostalgia, right?
So
it's
people of a certain socio-economic class and generation look back upon that period of 79 to 90 as a period in which a lot of dragons were slayed, trade union dragons, for example, and a lot of people made a lot of money. And so they're just really looking back upon their good old days, and Sunak and Truss are competing to promise to bring them back.
Yeah, look, and I say that as an RNT strike supporter now, right?
You've been on a journey, haven't you?
Yeah, exactly. Right? But, I've come I'm centre-right, right? And centre-right was what Thatcher was all about, right? It was about, sensible
a lot of people will be surprised to hear that, because, a lot of the legacy will be of violence. Poll tax riots and miners' strikes would stick out. So that the idea of it being a sort of pragmatic centrism, it might be true.
But that pragmatic centrism was about the economy, right? The unions were crippling the economy, right? It was about opportunity and growth and everything else. It was actually about actual economic growth, right?
And the proof of the pudding. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. The economy did grow.
It did grow, right? It was 19% over 7 years, right?
Yeah.
What do you want to say, right? Yeah. It worked, right? The back needed to be broken. That doesn't mean workers' rights are eliminated. It means they are respected in the right manner for an economy to function properly, right?
Yes.
I've come centre right. Look, Cameron was a posh version of it. Unfortunately, what's going on here? This is a right-wing swing to Thatcher in 81, 82, not 88, 89.
That's an astute observation. Yes. In fact, people forget, and I'm not name dropping because it's coming up on full disclosure in 6 weeks' time, but Ian McEwan, his new novel addresses climate change in an incredibly inventive and inspirational way. But he makes a point that one of the biggest speeches, one of the most powerful speeches ever given about the threat of climate change was given by Margaret Thatcher.
Absolutely. She was absolutely about good governance, good family, good home life, kind of sensible economics, right? And it wasn't the UK was the sick man of Europe. It's becoming the sick man of Europe, right?
But for very different reasons. So you see it, and I did warn you that I was coming to you before the junction, so we're short of time, but you see it as very cynical and actually quite dishonest posturing by these two.
Yeah, oh no, it's completely dishonest.
Even when Nigel Lawson joins in and says that Rishi Sunak is...
Oh, come on, look at his son, right? Just read, read his
I'd rather not. I'm a big fan of Nigella, but she seems to have fallen rather far from the family tree.
Nigella is the right side of the family. There's not a different side of the family.
No, it's a strange business. I'm going to crack on, but it's a great opening. You can't say fairer than that. A former chair of Young Conservatives, having remained on the right, but moved very differently from where the party has gone, explaining why Thatcher of a certain ilk, of a certain era, holds these people in thrall. But of course, what they're not going to say is that Margaret Thatcher, one of the first Western politicians to absolutely and passionately warn against the horrors of climate change, and indeed the key architect of the single market, when they say that they're going to be the most like Margaret Thatcher, they ain't talking about that.
LBC.
A few of you picking up on that point, that rather splendid opening call from Lee about why Margaret Thatcher's name is popping up more than anybody else's, even more than Boris Johnson's, in the battle to be the next Prime Minister. Here's a quote from 1975 that doesn't really fit the narrative of the cosplaying that Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak are undertaking. The choice is clear. We can play a role in developing Europe, or we can turn our backs. By turning our backs, we would forfeit our right to influence what happens, but what happens will inevitably affect us. And that is a quote that usually appears online alongside the famous image of Margaret Thatcher in a knitted dress featuring all the flags of Europe. It's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, it's some legacy when she can be held up as the heroine of Eurosceptics and yet is on the record as describing in absolutely incontrovertible terms the idiocy of turning our backs on the European Union. And many people don't understand. Again, massive failure of the Remain campaign. Don't know why. Cameron could have done this. She invented the single market. There's speeches where she describes, can you imagine what it would be like? She literally invented the single market. And then fast forward a few years, Theresa May, Priti Patel and the rest of them are boasting about pulling out of it. So why is Margaret Thatcher's ghost being invoked so much this year in this leadership battle? Ben's in Brighton. Ben, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thank you so much for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
I think because she's this kind of epochal figure, and they've only really had two figures like that in the 20th century. And what I mean
Who's
by
the
that
other
is
one?
the fact, I think Churchill was the other one.
Oh, fine, yeah, sorry. You said 20th
figure.
century. You threw me a bit.
20th
Yeah,
century,
fair enough, yeah.
Sorry. And I think there's that, and there's the fact that she genuinely seemed to alter the world. I mean, if you think about her and Reagan, you could argue that together they brought down the Berlin Wall. They offered freedom to the Eastern Bloc countries. They helped disarm as well. Nuclear disarmament was part of the Reagan-Thatcher agenda, which was a huge thing. And then on a more kind of personal note, for a lot of the people I grew up with in London, she offered the sale of council houses. Now, there are criticisms you can make of all of that stuff.
Of course.
The thing about Thatcher...
But we're talking about people who would not criticise it. That's the whole point this morning, aren't we? I mean, the basic conservative membership would not criticise or challenge any of the things that you've just said, which is why they keep invoking her ghost.
Yeah, and I think that she is this towering figure, and I think subsequent to her, there haven't been... I think, Major to me was it seems to be a pretty nice guy, and probably the last genuinely good man they had, good and honest man. But again, getting back to honesty, yes. She had real integrity. I mean, and I think when you invoke all of that, you're saying, look, I am someone that can change history. I am someone that can communicate with both the working class, the middle class, and even the upper class, although she very rarely mentioned them, because obviously she got a lot of jip from them when she first got into cabinet.
Yeah, but that's also relevant. She wasn't part of the patrician legacy. There's an antidote to the Etonian, just as she was an antidote to successive old Etonians running the party, barring Heath as well, of course. But so now you're going to be coming in off the back of 2 out of 3 of the last leaders being old Etonians. So there's a little bit of that. The mad bit is, and in a way, listening to you, Ben, it becomes the very essence of post-Brexit, post-Trump politics, is that they are nothing like her at all. And therefore, by claiming to be like, whether you like her or loathe her, these people are pathetic in comparison. And yet, by claiming to be like her, they're hoping that some of what you would call gloss in the course of this call will rub off on them.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Wow.
And I find it a bit wearying and a bit sad, really.
It's also, I mean, obviously it's working, so it's not insulting in the purest sense of the word, but they're holding the Conservative membership in pretty low regard, aren't they, if they think that they're going to fall for this crud, but fall for it they will.
Well, they appear to be falling for it at the moment, and it appears to be that I'm absolutely certain now that we're going to end up with Liz Truss as our next Prime Minister.
You're not going to win many prizes for that. Certainly not from William Hill. Thank you, Ben. I originally agreed completely with your first caller, says Aidan. Thatcher being used to talk to the Conservative membership. But then I wondered whether this holds true when you factor in the polls, which indicate that Johnson would win if he were on the ballot. Yeah, I think it does. I think Johnson is all things to all people. I think this is the point that we touched on yesterday, in that he is brilliant at being awful. He is the most brilliantly awful politician we will ever see, a little like Trump. And so they would, he can simultaneously be someone who's perceived as being Thatcherite and not Thatcherite, whereas this is a different proposition entirely with these two, and they are going all in on being Thatcherite. Another Margaret Thatcher quote for you. In fact, I should do these two quotes in juxtaposition so that we can get a nice clip out of it. But here's another one for you. Just think for a moment what a prospect that is. A single market without barriers, visible or invisible, giving you direct and unhindered access to the purchasing power of over 300 million of the world's wealthiest and most prosperous people. Bigger than Japan, bigger than the United States, on your doorstep, and with the Channel Tunnel to give you direct access to it. It's not a dream, it's not a vision, it's not some bureaucrat's plan, it's for real. I think Kay Burley's up next, isn't she, to do these hustings? Just read that to them, will you, when they start Thatcher cosplaying? Just read them that quote, and then read them the one about the madness of turning your back on Europe. And then maybe a little bit on the climate change speech that she gave quite early on in her premiership, and then admittedly failed to return to, because this is a parallel universe, a universe where Sunak and Truss, anti-European, single market leaving, mediocre politicians claiming to be Thatcherite in their outlook, when, well, you heard the words. John's in Croydon. John, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Yeah, she was a revolutionary.
How old are you? How old are you? I should have asked the other two callers that.
I'm 50-something.
50 what? I think 50. It's important.
Well, nearer 60 than 50.
Why are you being so coy?
Well, you shouldn't ask my age on air.
Why, you're not a lady?
What does it matter?
Carry on. Oh, well, no, I think it's really important. I said at the outset, age is going to be absolutely crucial to this conversation.
Well,
but you don't have to tell me if you don't want to. That's fine.
And if you didn't live through those times, then you still won't. You won't feel the affection that a significant amount of people have for that woman.
A significant amount of Conservative members or Conservative supporters.
No, James, and working class people as well.
Well, they're allowed to support the Conservatives and vote for them as well, John.
Of course.
Yeah.
Do you remember, James, when British Airways wanted to change their pattern on the back of their aeroplane? You're on the fin on the aeroplane.
No.
And she came along with her handkerchief and she said, no, we're not going to have that.
Right.
We want the Union flag back on it. That's what people want to see. It's not just about nationalism and jingoism. It's about pride in being British. And
British Airways is Spanish now,
She had that in spades. Yes. So who cares?
I don't know. You do. I'm a bit confused by what you're saying.
Well, I won't. I'm not. She put the pride back into Britain, James,
Okay.
and during that time, she had a lot of enemies. Obviously, being a woman, she had to fight harder than most to get to where she was. So Liz Truss, I think, has probably got a bit of an advantage because there are hints of Thatcher in Liz Truss. It's very weak.
Where? What are the?
She doesn't wear £400 shoes for a start, like Rishi Sunak. She gets her earrings from a high street. People don't like that, do they?
Margaret Thatcher had image consultants who took her to Aquascutum, where I used to work, and you wouldn't get much change. Listen. Let's not fall out. I don't think you've got much to say except that you really, really liked her and something about flags on jumbo jets.
James, she helped me a lot with my life.
Go on.
She helped me a lot. She liberated me financially. She liberated me. She allowed me to play the stock markets. I didn't need to go and find a stockbroker to do it. I'm just an ordinary person with a bit of savings.
This is why I was interested in your age. So you're very young to be playing the stock market.
James,
and
how did she... for the last 30 years? Where have you been for the last 30 years?
Well, I've been here for most of them, mate. It's no secret. So what?
And the city has been revolutionised since the late 1980s, James, hasn't it? It's no longer a posh man's club. Anybody can join it, and
again,
they do.
you're being a bit cryptic. So you were able to buy and sell shares.
Partly, yes.
Yeah,
of
okay.
course.
That's why. Just
Of
say it.
course.
I'm not being funny. I'm just a bit confused. So, okay. I mean, would you describe yourself as a typical Thatcherite? Do you think, John? A classical
No,
Thatcherite?
I describe myself as an ordinary working class person.
Right. An ordinary working class person who credits
who
Margaret
grew
Thatcher
up-
with allowing him to play the stock market. Also, you
No,
began by saying that
well,
working
no,
class
hang on,
people.
hang on a minute,
You began by
James.
saying that working class people
working
weren't
class
Thatcher
person-
supporters.
Let me finish this point. A working
Beginning
class
to wish you hadn't
person who
started.
saved his money,
Okay.
who saved his money through
Yes.
hard work.
Well done.
That's something that well done.
Yes.
That's something that she
Well done.
advocated as well, saving
Yes.
your money, and then thought, right, now what do we do with it?
Okay. Are you a member of the party?
No, I'm not a member of the party.
Okay, I'm only asking
No.
why you're so touchy, honestly. I wish I'd never asked your age. I just remind you that the question is, why are the two people vying to be Prime Minister invoking the ghost of Margaret Thatcher so much? So, listen, I appreciate that many people may not enjoy hearing people talk up her legacy or extol her virtues. I'm here just to make sure that there is some sort of basis and evidence to back up the admiration, as always, to ask you why you think what you think, not just what you think. But that's, obviously there's lots of people who don't cherish her legacy or don't think she was very good for the country. But that isn't an answer to the question of why these two characters, Truss and Sunak, are trying to invoke her ghost so much, trying to attach themselves to her legacy so much. I don't mind explaining that, but I don't know that I should have needed to do it yet again. So I'll read out a few of the texts coming from the sort of other end of the pitch, as it were. Please spare us the Thatcher swooning. Well, again, Paul, how can you have a conversation about why the two people who are going to be the next Prime Minister are competing to see who's the most passionate member of the Margaret Thatcher Club without having people express admiration of Margaret Thatcher? That's the last time I'm going to explain that. But I'll read your text out because I'm so nice. Thatcher is responsible for the absolute mess we're in right now with the energy crisis, selling off everything for short-term gain to make us look prosperous. Now we have no control, whereas France has, of course, limited the hikes in energy costs to 4%. Julie says, people who cheered on Thatcher's right to buy council homes because it would create Tory voters are now finding that their children and grandchildren can't afford market rent on a decent home. That seems a fairly solid contribution, as indeed does Paul's observation about privatisation. But neither of those observations answer the question of why these two are invoking her ghost so much. And finally, Claire says, I've no fond memories of Thatcher, apart from her views on EU membership. What she started has destroyed the country. Actually, I said that was going to be the last one. There was another one, I think, from Dorothy, who said, if Liz Truss has a bit of Margaret Thatcher, then I have a bit of Scarlett Johansson. 10:35 is the time. Matt's in Stafford. Matt, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. I'd just like to say that the most important thing for, I think, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak is the fact that Margaret Thatcher won. And I think that's the overriding thing that dominates British politics.
So did David Cameron and Boris Johnson.
But think about the current political climate. The RMT strikes, Thatcher won against the miners' strikes. Grant Shapps is talking consistently about reducing...
But Thatcher beat the miners by essentially closing down coal mining in this country. You don't want Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak to close down the railways, do you?
I definitely don't. But what I'm trying to say is that this is why they're invoking that. I don't think they'll go as forward and say, we'll just close it all down. But I definitely think they'll reduce workers' rights in this country. And I'm not saying that, that might be a good thing for some people. However, I think that...
Who would it be a good thing for?
I think it'd be a good thing for the railways, a lot of people with a lot of businesses, mainly the 1%, as it were. But I feel the big thing that Margaret Thatcher evoked...
Hang on a minute, you think that reducing workers' rights would be a good thing for the railways?
I think it'd be a good thing for the people who own the railways, certainly. Not for the workers, not for the people who go on the railways, not for me. And the fact is, my granddad was this job.
That's not why they're doing it, is it? I mean,
I feel like they're invoking that. I feel they're invoking that spirit of winning against any opposition. They want to win the next election. Boris Johnson was someone who won the election.
That's a pretty solid contribution.
And lost the backbenchers.
She's a winner. She's a winner. She's a winner. I mean, they did actually chuck her out at the end, just like they did Boris Johnson, but it took them a lot. It took them a lot longer to do so, and some people are still bruised by that. But Thatcher, how old are you?
I'm 28, sir.
Gosh, so that shadow, if you like, that she casts over British politics is one of which you have absolutely no personal experience. Well, you have no experience of the woman. You have experience only of the shadow. I think this is really important, Matt, because from your 28-year-old perspective, you look at the record and you just see someone who won 3 general elections.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. But the thing is,
you really can't argue with that. It's the same with Tony Blair, isn't it? You know, there it is. Did she win 3? 79? Yeah, of course she did.
And that's the thing that matters in this day and age, isn't it? Like, I feel like Tony Blair will, in 20 years, hopefully, be looked upon as the Labour Prime Minister who won. But that's not all he did. And there are things that he's done in his prime ministerial reign, you might say, that will have terrible effects, I think, by the Iraq War. But people only look back on the fact that he won.
He won 3 elections. I mean, it is a point of great contention among the competing factions of the Labour movement, of course, of just how important winning is. Keir Starmer being a little bit closer to the Tony Blair view that winning is the most important thing, or was it Bill Shankly who said winning isn't the important thing; it's the only thing. That is very much the Conservative mantra traditionally, and Tony Blair, a Labour leader who subscribe to the same school of thought. I think you're probably onto something. Maybe, again, we might be ever so slightly overthinking it, although there's plenty of room for sophisticated analysis on this. Bottom line is, it would be a bit like whoever takes over at Manchester United invoking the spirit of Alex Ferguson. Although, of course, he is still with us, so they wouldn't need to invoke his spirit. They could just invite him into the dressing room. Or you take over at Nottingham Forest and you talk about Brian Clough. You wouldn't talk about Frank Clark, or you wouldn't talk about people who'd been in post. You wouldn't talk, if you're at United, about Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, would you? Or indeed about David Moyes. You'd talk about Alex Ferguson. So that's part of it. But in terms of the membership, the appeal must be a little bit more specific than that. The appeal must be, we want someone like Thatcher, not just because she wins, but because of what she does when she's won. And I want to know. Gemma is in Cheltenham. Gemma, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello. Yeah, I think you are overthinking it a little bit.
Oh, everyone's a critic.
Sorry.
Everyone's a critic. Can I ask how old you are? You don't have to tell me, but I am interested.
No, I'll tell you. I'm 45.
45, right. Carry on.
So I was, but I vividly remember things like the poll tax riots. I'm a bit of a strange human. So, but the thing to me is, so I know my parents are friends with 2 Tory party members in their 70s. Okay. And even though they've got children and grandchildren, they are rubbing their hands in glee at the prospect of the 7% interest rates. But apart from that... Because they've got savings. I mean, that... Yeah, because they've got savings. They're sitting pretty. But I don't think it's about policy, aside from that. It's just about them remembering a time when they lived in a world that wasn't scary. Yeah. It's just, you know, all these people that put their pronouns on their Twitter feeds, and he was a he, but now it's a she, and all these people that, these temples being built,
had a caller. Nick had a caller earlier complaining about how many black people there are in adverts on television. We're talking about that sort of outlook, aren't we?
Absolutely, because I mean, again, I don't have any figures to back this up, but I grew up in a relatively multicultural area, and I remember going out on different places like I didn't grow up here.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, I think Cheltenham had the first black Tory candidate. Is a guy called Taylor, if memory serves. So I'll wind my neck in.
So I'm out in the Cotswolds.
Okay.
So but it wasn't. Our multicultural society was, in my memory, much more concentrated in particular urban areas, and we have things like Clause 28. Keeping the homosexuals away. Yeah. I think it's all those. It's that.
And now, do you know what you've done? You've solved a mystery for me, actually, which I feel a little bit stupid for not having spotted it. I don't know if you're aware that Suella Braverman, who's been Attorney General for a number of years in a party that's been in government for 12 years, has decided that today is the day to launch a fight back against woke witch trials. And the Daily Mail inevitably has come out in full support of her. And when you read it and you read into it, God, you've made me feel really stupid. It is literally...
Oh, I'm sorry, I think you're very intelligent.
Thank you, you're very kind. Liar. But it is literally just telling people, and this is why the demographics of the Conservative membership are so crucial, it's literally saying we can turn the clock back.
Yes, because everything that's happened since the 80s, and particularly if you think about their age, I know my mum's friends, they were in their heyday in the 80s, and they're in the South, and the miners' strikes and all those things didn't touch them. And so, they're insulated, or they were insulated from everything.
And they don't have any personal experience of all the stuff they're frightened of, but they read about it in their newspapers and spend their lives being terrorised. And
they do see, our Cotswolds village now, on a day, if I walk down the village now, has got every single culture sat picnicking. And actually, 30 years ago, I don't know if that would have been the case.
No,
so
well, it wouldn't. And oddly,
that...
it's the so-called diversity programme or political correctness or the woke mob that have helped create a country in which Priti Patel and Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid can rise to the top of the Conservative Party and potentially to the country. What would have happened to those no blacks, no dogs, no Irish signs if it wasn't for the woke mob? It's so bizarre how this unfolds, isn't it? But there it is. Yeah, I guess.
And all I can say is not in my name. It's easy to think, oh gosh, this is everybody, but it's not. It is a tiny minority of people.
That's all they need. So it's well off. It's well off. White pension. Well, no, I mean they're not all like that, but I mean, and it might be mild race. But why would someone like Suella Braverman be launching attacks upon anti-racism initiatives in the workplace? Answer: because she wants to win the support of people who don't like anti-racism initiatives in the workplace.
Because it makes them feel. I spent most of my career teaching English as an additional language to people that had not, children that had not long been in the country. And when you can see, if I mention that to people sometimes, you can almost see the kind of panic in their face. Because it's something that is so alien to them. And like you say, they might not be actively racist, but the fact that, there are schools in Hounslow where we're experts at that, and that's in their country, it's scary to them. Right.
And of course, it is a very lucrative business, stoking those fears and coming into those worldviews, whether it's boats, dinghies, desperate people in dinghies crossing the channel, or whether it's black people in adverts, or whether it is footballers taking the knee, something we may talk about later, or whether it is Germans trying to succeed where they failed during the Second World War. I mean, listen, if you don't read these newspapers, you might think that I've gone bonkers or that Gemma has been grossly unfair, but that's the bit missing from my jigsaw, isn't it? Of course they're going to pretend that this stuff is really, really important, because otherwise people with a vote in this election might turn around and say, Liz Truss has spent more time in the cabinet than any other Conservative in the House of Commons since 2010. Rishi Sunak was the second most powerful politician in the last Conservative government. Why are they both competing to condemn the country that they will inherit when they become Prime Minister, when the party that we are members of has been in charge for 12 years? Answer: look, over there, some diversity training and some kneeling footballers and some National Trust initiatives. Don't look at the record of the last 12 years when you're trying to decide which member of the same team will captain the side going forward. Look over there at some dinghies. And that, I guess, is why they cite Thatcher, because rightly or wrongly, she represents that period before all the pesky political correctness came along. That's just one strand of this conversation, of course, but I think it might be my favourite so far. If I'm sounding a little humbler than usual, yeah, it's possible. I am, aren't I? Sounding a bit more humble? It's because I went to see Brian Cox last night, Professor Brian Cox at the Royal Opera House, and his new show. My goodness me. I'm hoping that I managed to learn some stuff via osmosis, because I certainly didn't keep up with absolutely everything that he was talking about. Man, that guy's so clever. And I'm delighted to tell you he's my guest on this week's Full Disclosure, which will drop, as the Utes say, on Friday. It's a cracking thing as well. And we explore some themes that come up in the new show, which is in London this week and then hits the road nationwide in September, end of August, September. Because a lot of prominent people are asked why they don't go into politics. You'd be pretty confident, wouldn't you, if we had a government that contained people like Martin Lewis and Brian Cox? It'd be pretty good, right? And me. But the question is one that he feels better than most when he says, I think you have to keep the possibility open. And there's a physicist called Richard Feynman who worked with Philip Oppenheim on the atomic bomb. And he turned his attention to politics, academically speaking. He didn't become a politician, talking about what politics could learn from science in general and physics in particular. I suppose what I'm saying is, if you like listening to clever people, then download Full Disclosure podcast, featuring at least one clever buzz. At least. 10:49 is the time. Mick's in Chesterfield. Mick.
Good morning, James.
What is it about Thatcher that sees her writ so large in a leadership election being fought by two people who were still in... I can't say short trousers, can I? Because but you take my point. Who were still at kindergarten when she became prime minister, and in Rishi Sunak's case, still at nursery.
Well, in many ways, they're calling on somebody that's got characteristics that they don't possess. So you know, it's very much a case of both of the candidates for the Conservative leadership and therefore Prime Ministership of this country that are trying to appeal. Let's focus on the fact that they're trying to appeal to less than 200,000 people that are members of the Conservative Party to put them into a position of power. So, you know, they're not in the slightest bit, in my mind, really interested in appealing to what the ordinary man and woman in the street is.
No, but, about. You know, to be, I mean, clear, why would they?
Exactly. Exactly the point.
Yeah, because this is, I mean, they may pivot and change. You have to hope that they will, because the interests of 60 million people are unlikely to be very well reflected in the interests of this tiny number that you described. No one's entirely clear what it is, but I think everyone agrees it's under 200,000. What is it then that they invoke when they invoke her name? What do this electorate, these Conservative members, feel or see when they both claim to be Thatcher's natural heir, the heir of Thatcher, the heir of Voldemort?
They're mostly appealing to white, middle-aged
middle-aged
middle-aged at best.
Yeah.
You know, and and many young Conservative members are still very romantically linked to that sort of ideal of, you know, wasn't Thatcher a wonderful person? Despite the fact that, as you've rightly pointed out before, if you're under the age of 40, you probably never had any direct.
50.
You know, probably never had anything else.
50 even. If you're 50, you left school the year she left Downing Street. So, you know, she'd have taken away your school milk and stuff like that, and you'll be aware of things like the poll tax and bubbling away in the background.
Exactly.
But she wouldn't have had an impact upon your own economic situation. She may have had an impact on your mum and dad's. But it's a weird one, isn't it? I mean, I think a combination of all the calls today, just simply being a winner, three victories on the card is one reason that you'd wear her badge when competing to be the leader of the party. And when you look, as you've reminded us again, at the demographics, the detail of who's actually got a vote, the turning the clock back card is probably the biggest, isn't it?
Well, it is, because it harks back to a period of time when most people that were, that were casting votes had experienced very good times. You know, the people that were casting votes in the late 1970s.
It's crucial, the chronology, post-war settlement. So these are people who could almost remember rationing. They almost would have or their parents could. So they grew up with either the memory of privations or the next generation memory of privations. And suddenly in the 80s, there was an awful lot of money sloshing about. It didn't reach all corners of the country. But you remember the Harry Enfield character that was conceived as satire, taking the mickey out of these lads on building sites who were suddenly as rich as Croesus. And of course he ended up, and it made Harry Enfield very uncomfortable because he ended up becoming a sort of folk hero for greed and acquisitiveness.
And that, sadly, that aspiration for greed still drives most of today's politics,
which takes us back to Gemma's parents' friends who can't wait for massive interest rates to kick in because they've got so much saved that they'll be laughing even as they absorb the cost of rocketing inflation. Thank you, Mick. Hannah is in Hull. Hannah, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I think it's, there's the big part about Thatcher as a person, and I couldn't comment on that because I was too young to understand all of that. But I think it's more about who Sunak and Truss are as people, and they've kind of understood. You've touched on this earlier in the programme. They've understood their weaknesses, possibly, in their character flaws, and they're coming off the back of, whether you like him or not, and I can't stand the man, a very popular Prime Minister in Boris Johnson, and they've got to emulate some sort of popularity for themselves to follow in, like, quite large boots, I guess.
So there's a vacuum. There are two vacuums here. I mean, Truss is astonishing in the Groucho Marx sense of the word, when, you know, says, I got opinions, and if you don't like my opinions, I got other ones. So she is astonished. She's like a weather vane, isn't she? Sunak less so, although he seems happy to abandon a couple of relatively recent convictions in pursuit of power. But if you're not quite sure what they stand for, just shouting Margaret Thatcher at the top of their voices is quite a useful and effective substitute for this particular electorate.
Yeah, and I think, I bet Truss was absolutely gutted when Sunak said Margaret Thatcher as well, because that's her.
So what else he could have said? I suppose he could have really rolled the dice and gone for Winston Churchill, couldn't he?
Possibly, yeah. But yeah, I think it's more about their failures as characters, or their understanding that they're not going to be as popular as Johnson, so they're just clinging on to the next most popular figure, and trying to shine off.
It is. Yeah, I mean, I don't like the phrase overthinking, because it almost sounds a bit that we're congratulating ourselves for being so clever. But it is probably simpler than, you know, detailed economic policy or taxation legacy, isn't it? It's how these people feel watching these hustings when they claim that they'll bring back the 1980s, when, you know, you could say what you wanted about immigration without being called a racist, and you had quite a few more quid in the bank than you do now, and the world was a lot less confusing. And something about toilets and penises, which seems to be a large part of the culture war at the moment.
Oh, God, yeah. But yeah, I don't even think it's like overthinking it. That was my very first thought of that Boris Johnson's still very popular, and if he was on the ballot, he'd win. Yeah. They've got to make themselves stand out, and if they can't align themselves with Johnson, even though Truss, I'm sure, would love to, then the next person to align themselves is Thatcher.
Would be Margaret Thatcher. She kind of has semi-aligned herself with Johnson by playing up the loyalty card, and of course one of the biggest obstacles Sunak has is overcoming the fact that he's perceived as having sort of led the defenestration process for Boris Johnson. Thank you, Anna. 10:57 very nearly. Brilliant calls today. Let's go to Devon next. Gillian is in Plymouth. Gillian, what would you like to say? Gisella. Why did I say Gillian? Honestly, I'm so sorry. Do you know, that's my age, that is, Gisella. I need to borrow Steve Allen's glasses.
I'm a first-time caller, so I'm really nervous. So you just have to excuse if I kind of repeat myself.
It's only me.
So I was listening. I'm 49 in a few weeks, so I really remember living in the 80s and seeing what my parents went through and struggled through. And I just find it amazing that someone like Liz Truss, for example, who talks about the fact that she went to comprehensive school and the life chances of her peer group, and she was under a Tory government.
Yes.
And living under Margaret Thatcher. So I find it really
well, we're not here.
That she's talking about it as if it's an amazing
No, she's crackers.
time.
She's crackers. I mean, she wasn't talking about it as an amazing time. Actually, to correct you, she was talking about how awful it was without realising. And then all the people that were at school with her and all her teachers have turned around and said, you're talking absolute twaddle. It was nothing like that at all. And Roundhay is to Leeds what Chelsea is to London. So the idea that she was trying to portray herself as living in some sort of ghetto or deprived corner of the city is palpably absurd, but even more stupidly, talking about how bad it was, and I became a Conservative because I wanted to make things better. Her period of schooling was contained entirely within the period of Margaret Thatcher's premiership.
Yeah, that's what I find. I just find it utterly bizarre that she's championing Margaret Thatcher when she was living under that government. And I remember how bad it was. My parents having to sell things every week.
Yeah, but your parents are not Conservative Party members. So
no,
you know,
not.
I mean, you've come in towards the end of the conversation. We're examining what it is about them that the Thatcher ghost appeals to so completely. But just to take up your theme of Liz Truss saying words without being too bothered about their actual meaning and focused entirely upon their emotional impact. Here's an actual quote. See if you can spot the problem with this, Gisella. This is from Liz Truss. There are too many people in this country who are ashamed of our history, who talk our country down, who say the best days are behind us. They are completely wrong.
Okay. I don't know who she's trying to.
Well, she's trying. No, nor do I.
There.
Because you're not allowed. So the best days are not behind us, but stop talking down our history, which is the days that are behind. Because the days ahead of us are better than the days behind us, but the days behind us should never be criticised. But by saying that the days ahead are better than the days behind, I'm actually criticising. Do you see what I mean about words?
Yeah, and she is just trying to focus her kind of rhetoric at a certain type of electorate who are either Tories of a certain age or people who, like I think one of your previous callers said, just romanticise of somebody who they never lived under, so they have no idea.
We had a lovely time in the 80s, and therefore we want to go back to that. Or, because of the nature of the British media, I've spent my entire adult life reading hagiographies of her everywhere from the Daily Mail to the Daily Telegraph, and therefore I presume it was some sort of golden age, even though, as Gisela has reminded us at the end of that hour, for huge numbers, for millions of families in this country, it was an absolute nightmare.